What's up, geeks and gamers? It's Odin coming back with the box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Transformers Rise of the Beast coming in with a $171 million global opening, which means that if indeed this film has made about a third of what its end total is going to be, and that's what most films tend to on average make about a third of their entire box office in their opening global weekend, that means this film has a chance of breaking even to make a little over $500 million worldwide, but a lot still remains to be seen. As you all know, we always like to wait for that week 2 drop-off because that tells us a lot about how the legs on this movie actually are, whether people are going to continue to see this, especially as competition begins to roll up as we are continuing to go through the summer season, as many films are still yet to actually premiere. All this while Across the Spiderverse has now closed in on $400 million worldwide and has already started to make profits, already started to add to the overall profit of the Spiderverse universe. And hey, kudos to them for being able to make a film for $100 million and therefore be able to actually make profits in the first couple weeks of release. Whereas a film like Little Mermaid, costing $250 million, is still very much on the line for what likely will end up being around $100+ million in losses for Disney. Disney in a very, very bad place at this point in time. But starting first off over at Deadline, as you can see, Nancy, our girl Nance over at Deadline, talking about the decent opening weekend for Transformers Rise of the Beast. I won't say it is truly massive. If you compare this to some of the other Transformers films, right? The Transformers franchise for a very long time was a billion-dollar franchise, made a lot of money, especially with massive budgets. This film coming in with a much lower budget compared to some of those other movies, and so therefore that is why it is not a complete box office flop at this point in time, though it is also not it's not the worst performing opening weekend domestically, but it's also really not all that great either. When you actually adjust those numbers for inflation, it just barely edges out the last film that came out in 2017, not counting, of course, Bumblebee, as that is kind of in its own area in a certain regard. But as you can see, in 68 overseas markets, Paramount, Skydance, Hasbro's Transformers Rise of the Beast has pounced on a $110 million opening. Combined with domestic, that gives the Autobots and Maximals a global debut of $170.5 million, coming in ahead of projections, so doing better than expected. But I gotta go back to the fact that even though it is doing better than certain projections, it's not doing well enough for it to say that it's a return to form or that it is doing as well as some of those earlier films in the franchise. As I said here, offshore and excluding China, it's interesting how they always like to do that over here on Deadline, the debut is 36% ahead of the previous title, Bumblebee, which opened during the Christmas corridor in 2018. So this film is actually doing right now, if it does that standard 3 times the opening weekend, then it actually should come in above where Bumblebee is unadjusted. So we'll have to, of course, break those numbers down. I'll do a much fuller box office breakdown sometime this week, going into the entirety of the Transformers franchise. But as of this point in time, it's doing okay. But again, it kind of remains to be seen. I know there are some people that are still big fans of these movies, or at least still very big fans of the Transformers franchise. I've not heard very good things about Rise of the Beast from the people who have seen it, but if you are a fan of this movie, this film is actually still doing well enough to definitely be in a better position. I would much rather be the executives in charge of Transformers Rise of the Beast than I would be the persons in charge of Little Mermaid. Little Mermaid, guaranteed $100+ million flop, whereas this movie, hey, it has a chance to make its money back potentially. Going into the numbers, talking about the domestic opening weekend, Transformers Rise of the Beast, $60.5 million. So going into the weekend, there were some had projected, Box Office Pro had projected that they thought Spider-Man Across the Spiderverse was having a good chance of maybe even coming in at the number 1 spot 2 weeks in a row. That did not happen. Essentially, it's because Transformers did better than what had been expected, and Spider-Verse did basically what they thought it was going to do. Transformers making 60.5, whereas Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse dropped only 54% in its second week. And on top of adding to that the fact that it had a very strong opening weekend, much stronger than expected, and it did pretty well in the markets it needed to internationally, this film has already made money, is making money, and it will continue to add to its profits over the course of the next several weeks. When you're 2 weeks out and you're already hitting that bare minimum break-even point, guess what? That's a good sign for you, so kudos to Sony for being able to pull that off. Can't say the same thing for Little Mermaid. It's interesting how even Scotty Boy Mendelsohn, who used to be at Forbes and now he's kind of just off doing his own thing, I guess. He's kind of off in obscurity in a certain regard. I think he's still active on social media, on Twitter, though, because I saw people tagging me in one of the comments saying, Little Mermaid, even though let's just forget about the international numbers there because domestically it's doing fantastic. Well, yes, you can look at that number and say 3 weeks out, a 45% hold. That seems pretty good. It's still making $22 million. But when you actually compare this to even just a film back in 2019, like talking about live action Aladdin, The film is still tracking well below those numbers when you actually compare like-to-like figures, when you actually compare ticket sales and the average ticket price, looking at those numbers, adjusting for inflation, all those things that you have to do in order to give a fair comparison between those two. Little Mermaid ain't up there. So yes, that $220 million domestic, they'll try and say, well, it's going to be one of the highest domestic box office, probably maybe even top 10 domestic box offices for the year. Doesn't mean that the film's successful, doesn't mean the film's making money, and in fact, it means the exact opposite. So, hey, good for you, Disney. Can't say the same thing for Guardians, though. Guardians not only hit its break-even point, has been now adding on to its profits, still having pretty strong hold 6 weeks out from its initial release. This film has now crossed $800 million worldwide, and I've been saying this for a while that I think it actually has a chance to have enough momentum to possibly be able to even catch up to the numbers that were set by Wakanda Forever. And as far as the entirety of the MCU, that's not all that impressive. But for this film, in this specific franchise of the Guardians, it is definitely in a better position. And hey, kudos to them for being able to actually make their money back on that film. Coming in the number 5 spot is The Boogeyman from 20th Century Studios, a subsidiary of Disney. This film dropping 44%, and even though having a much smaller budget, not looking like in a strong position to make its money back. Going worldwide for a moment, let's go ahead and look at Transformers, $170.5 million. So the reason why I said that this is, again, better than expected, and some could even say that this is good, but it's not fantastic, is go ahead and compare this film to the entirety of the Transformers franchise, right? If you go back to Age of Extinction, right, you had $1 billion film. Dark of the Moon, $1 billion film. Revenge of the Fallen back in 2009, that film actually worldwide was also able to make well over $1 billion as well. I was looking at the international numbers, which is why I hiccup there, but as you can see, from a very profitable franchise, kind of fell off the map because it started to become very monotonous, becoming, very much the same every single time, and people kind of fell away from it. That's why you see kind of the entire box office kind of just disappear completely between Age of Extinction and last night when you look at the opening weekends. 127 versus 52, so about half of the audience at that point. So even though it has been able to recover a little bit, I believe that Bumblebee was maybe even in the 40s. Let me go ahead and see if I can actually add that film in here, because we like to do things live here over on Geeks and Gamers just to make sure that we have this as a metric, because I do believe this is doing better than what Bumblebee did. Yeah, Bumblebee had not a 40, $24 million opening weekend. So this film vastly outperforming Bumblebee, but as far as films labeled Transformers, right? That's before its actual name. As you can see, it's nowhere near the healthy level that the film and the franchise had been previously. And so what does that mean? That means Bumblebee, adjusted for inflation, made about a $533 million. I think that there's a good chance that this film comes in underneath where Bumblebee did. Again, using that 3 times multiplier versus the first week, which is, again, the average of what most films do. So it's not the rule, it's just the average. If that holds, if it does basically what an average movie would do hold-wise, then that film has a chance of not coming in nearly as high as Bumblebee. And Bumblebee actually had a much lower budget than even the mainstream Transformers film, Rise of the Beast. So, whether or not it's going to be profitable still remains to be seen. There seems to be a decent chance. However, let's just say Transformers franchise is not in a very healthy place right now. I can't say the same thing for Across the Spiderverse. This film nearing $400 million worldwide. Will very much be able to cross that. This movie is also doing very well, especially in comparison to the previous film. We'll probably have a really good chance of actually being able to beat out the original film in the franchise. And I've got some projections on what I think this film is going to do, and we'll talk about those in a second. Little Mermaid, $400 million worldwide. This film, I think, is going to, struggle to cross $500 million. The question, I think, is going to be, when does it cross $500 million, and by how much does it cross $500 million? Even if that is the case, and even when that does happen, it's still going to be far away from its break-even point because of that massive budget. Guardians, $800 million there. Again, as I've mentioned previously, 2.5 times the budget is the break-even point that I use. This film is now 3.2 times the budget. So even if you are someone that uses a 3 times multiplier for your break-even, this film has also been able to cross that. So hey, kudos to them for making probably the best MCU film since Infinity War, which doesn't saying a whole lot, but hey, they have to have some positive news every now and then, I guess. The Boogeyman, $39 million, Fast 10, as basically slowing down, and because of its massive, insanely massive budget, probably will end up losing quite a bit of money. So Transformers at $170.5 million, based off of a $200 million budget. That's a big problem, I think, for that movie, right? They're still spending way too much money on this franchise, especially the franchise that has fallen away. Its break-even point then is around $500 million, right? For some, it might be higher if you use a 3 times multiplier, but as you can see at this point in time, it is still very far off. So even though This film does what what other films do, and is able to triple its worldwide totals. Right? If this is just a third of its worldwide totals, then we could potentially see this film hit its break-even point. But if you're just barely hitting your break-even point, and that's your average showing, let's just say that is definitely not the best look overall. Spider-Verse, now that it is 2 weeks out, we can now make some projections on the film. So the film, having reached $400 million, around $400 million in the first 2 weeks, means that I'm projecting the film to probably make somewhere between $557 and $770 million when everything is said and done. 770 if it's able to double what it's made already, which some films can do. This film's definitely having some strongholds, so you might see it. Again, we don't see a lot of films these days actually accomplish this. Kind of going back to some of the more recent films that was able to just powerhouse through it. I think the last one on record, at least that I've been covering, was the Super Mario Brothers movie. That film was able to make a crap ton extra money after its initial opening weekend. And then you, of course, can go to Top Gun Maverick that also had a very similar number. We're not seeing those kind of drops for Spider-Verse, so it's doing well, but for it to do that, it would have to do a little bit better than that. But hey, for that film, only cost $100 million. This film is looking at probably close to $200 million in net gain profits. It's already hit the profitability territory. So, hey, kudos to them and congratulations. Boogeyman, we can also make some projections on. So even though this film cost quite a lot less, like $35 million, not making nearly enough to make its money back. And so this film likely going to be a flop. We've already talked about in previous weeks The Machine. What's interesting, though, is looking at The Little Mermaid. Right now, it's at $126 million in the red. And this is much more conservative estimate. So there are some people that would actually have the film being a much bigger flop than even I do, right? My break-even point is $625 million for this movie. Some have it as 3 times the number, right? So looking closer to $800 million. Either way, whether you use the more conservative or what some deem to be the more accurate number of 3 times the budget, it's not a good look in either case. You're still looking in any of those situations at $100 million or more in financial losses just from the movie alone. And for those going to try and say, well, what about marketing and what about toys and everything like that? Again, toys haven't really been selling nearly as well in more recent days. This is something that I feel like has been talked about, especially by Disney, going all the way back to Solo: A Star Wars Story, right? With all of the Star Wars toys, right? Merchandising not doing as well as had been expected. So the question is, how much are you actually going to sell in that merchandise? And is it going to be enough to make up for the $100 million loss that the film itself is actually going to have on the books for Disney? In addition to all of the other financial losses, I think Elemental coming up very soon is also going to be another major financial loss for Disney. It's just not looking good for them whatsoever. Fast 10, again, because of its massive budget, is still over $100 million in the red. And even though my projections had the possibility of the film breaking even based on the numbers that we're seeing, probably not going to happen. The film did very, very poorly domestically, and that's where it gets a larger return on money. So the fact that it is very much heavily invested, or it's getting most of its money from international, is actually an even worse sign for this film's chances of profitability. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, $800 million worldwide. Again, I've talked about how this film was a break even, and this film also been performing pretty well, right? Performing within its range, and has a decent chance of actually being able to perform well enough to maybe even pass up the likes of Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. Those are the numbers as they stand. What are y'all's thoughts? Have you seen Spider-Verse? Have you seen Rise of the Beast? Did you like Rise of the Beast? Do you think the film is going to be able to break even? And how much money do you think Spider-Verse is going to make? I think the chances of it getting to the point of, not only crossing $500 million, but my question is going to be more so, when does Spider-Man cross the entire lifetime total of Little Mermaid? It's going to happen, and especially because of the budget differences, Spider-Verse already profitable, Little Mermaid still guaranteed to be a $100 million flop. You love to see it. Anyway, let me know your thoughts about this stuff and all the things I mentioned in the comment section down below. If this video, smash that like button. Whatever it is you're watching, smash it. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, a blessed Sunday, and as always, God bless.